Hey everyone, this is the recorded version of the exam 2 review session. In this PowerPoint, we're going to go through about 12 different graphs, and we're going to discuss the implications, what's happening in it. And these are graphs that are all fair game to see on Friday for your test, okay? All right, so first we're going to start with, so what this was during the exam review is it's uh, it's an interactive PowerPoint. So what you all would have been doing is dragging a little icon over to the points where we're talking about here. So first off, we're going to talk. Let's answer this question. Drag the star to the price suppliers will receive after the tax has been paid. So in this case, here we're looking at a supply and demand curve. We had our original equilibrium here at P3. We had our free market, that perfect competition, free market price would have been P3. So coming in, we're charging this tax. So we're charging a tax equal to this vertical distance, okay? So from P to P4, that's our tax. All right, so to see the price that the suppliers are going to receive after the tax has been paid, what we're going to do is come over here to where we are hitting our new supply with that tax. Because it's a tax on suppliers, it's going to shift that supply curve. And at every point, we're going to have a higher price, a smaller quantity. So we go to where that new supply curve with that tax is going to cross our demand curve. And then we go down. When we go down, we're able to see wherever that hits on that supply curve is where that's that price suppliers are going to receive after the tax, okay? So originally we're at price of 3, and this is the price that individuals or suppliers would receive after selling their good. But because of this tax now, this vertical tax here, suppliers are only going to receive this price of P, all right? All right, so looking at our next slide, once again, here was that price that suppliers are going to receive. So now moving on to this next graph, what we're looking at is some kind of externality. So here we have that social marginal cost. At this point, we have that social marginal cost curve. And then here we have that social marginal cost curve. Down here, it looks like we have the same marginal benefit for supply and demand. So it looks like this is a negative externality. We have that private marginal cost here. And then at every point, at the same point, we're going to increase because of this externality. In order to account for this externality, we're going to see the shift to this marginal social cost curve. So shifting it to the left means we're increasing the price at every point because this externality is creating some third-party costs that hadn't been considered in the private market. So if we wanted to account for that third-party cost, we would find the social optimum from that social marginal cost curve, okay? So as I said in the last graph, this vertical distance here is going to tell us how much we are taxing. This vertical distance is going to tell us how much we need to remedy, how much we need to correct in order to manage some kind of externality, okay? So in this case, they want us to show the two amounts that are going to show us that per unit tax we need. So like I said, it's going to be this vertical distance from here to here. I could go down to this point here. So anytime I move in between these curves, so this distance should be the same as this distance, okay? All the way down, these lines should stay parallel. So I know that this distance here is going to be the same as this distance here. So the two prices that I need to look at, to use to calculate that tax needed to correct the externality is going to be that P1 and P3. So P3 minus P1 is going to equal that amount of tax. All right. So we move to that next slide. P1, P3. Okay. Let's move on. All right, so this is a graph also looking at a tax. Once again, we're going to look at a tax about this big, this vertical distance right here. This is the tax. All right. So in this question, because our tax, we're using an excise tax. It's a negative tax on an excise tax is some negative behavior, some undesired behavior we're trying to incentivize people away from. Okay. So that's what an excise tax is. So they want to see the quantity that will result from this tax. All right. So we know in order to find the equilibrium after a new tax is put into place, we're going to find that new supply curve where it crosses the demand curve. We're looking here, and then we follow this line down and we see that quantity 3 is where we're going to end up. Originally, we were over at quantity 4. We were here at quantity 4 before, but now we're at quantity 3 when there's some kind of tax thrown into play. Okay. There's going to be waste and that dead weight loss. Once again, we're going to go to that point where supply, that new supply with the tax curve crosses that demand curve, go down to that old supply curve and find that dead weight loss as well. We could show dead weight loss in this graph. So to draw that triangle, this is our waste from adding a tax into this market. Okay. So this triangle here is going to represent that lost trade, that those lost gains that we could have had originally. If there was no tax thrown into this market, we would have had this much more. And so in order to measure how much more exactly, what we would do is find the area of this triangle. Not going to do that, but like I said, that makes a lot more sense when you think about, okay, we're throwing in this new tax and we're losing people on this demand curve here because now our price is higher. We're losing all these people here. So this is our dead weight loss. Here's our new point, and Q3 is our new quantity. Okay. All right, so looking at this next graph, what we're looking at is just a plain supply and demand curve, okay, with an equilibrium at Q3, P3. So here we have that equilibrium. This is our golden rule of thumb. Here is where we would want to be ideally. This is where we would be in a perfectly competitive market at that P3, Q3. When government comes in and establishes some kind of price ceiling in a market. So what a price ceiling does is sets a maximum allowed price. So in this case, we are trying to protect consumers from the price of this good rising from too high, okay? So now in this case, what we're looking at, when we throw this price ceiling into this market, we're going to be at price of 1, not because of the market, not because of anything that happened, but because government comes in and establishes this price ceiling. Legally, you cannot price anything other than higher than P1. Okay. So click on the price this good will be sold for. So once again, we're now going to be at P1, and we're also now going to see a massive shortage in this market because of this price ceiling. So when government comes in and legally lowers this price, more people come into the market, we have a higher demand, and they say, oh, for that price of P1, sure, I would buy this good. Over here, at the price of P1, suppliers are going to start dropping out of the market. It's not worth it for those higher cost producers to stay in the market at such a low selling price, right? So in this case now of a price ceiling, we have right here, this is our shortage, all right? So price ceilings can be a good thing. It can protect consumers from the price of any one good from skyrocketing too high, all right? So it protects it protects consumers from that, from producers taking advantage of any kind of consumer in a certain situation. But what we're going to see is now, like I said, this shortage here. So instead of deciding who is allocated these goods, we now have a more scarce supply. Who gets these goods? We have a really high demand. So who actually gets this small supply of goods that are produced, that are put into the supply chain? So now, instead of using price as a factor to determine who's getting these last goods, what's going to be the deciding factor is who can wait in line the longest. So think about Black Friday. When prices go very, very low, there are not going to be many of these goods to be sold. Say at Best Buy, they're selling 100 TVs for $50 each. We know that there's going to be a really high demand for that. But since there's a really small supply, the factors that determine who is going to get these goods is now going to come down to either some kind of who's waiting in line the longest. Like I said, it's going to come down to who can purchase it first, who can fight the other out for it. So we can start to see the issues when this price ceiling comes into play. We're not going to have as much of a supply. We're going to have issues with supply. And now our big thing is, how do we determine who gets what? How do we determine who values this good at what price? Because originally we were showing a demand curve made up of all these different willingness to pays. So up here, these people would have paid some massively high price of P5. Down here, everybody in this market is joining. We have a much higher demand at a lower price. That makes sense? Okay. So moving on to the next slide. Now we're looking at same thing. So don't look at this. We're still looking at a price ceiling here. So identify the two numbers that are going to help us calculate, not a surplus, but it is going to be a shortage. Sorry, a few typos. So a surplus would be if we were looking at a price floor where it's a minimum allowed price, where a shortage tells us quantity supply is greater than that quantity demanded, right? Because we don't have enough to go around. What a surplus is going to tell us is the opposite. Our demand is higher than our supply here. So we have a surplus of product. All right. So let's identify the two numbers that help us calculate that shortage. So once again, we're gonna go to this price ceiling where legally we cannot go above this price ceiling. So first, what we're going to see is that price ceiling cross that supply curve over here. And we're going to see that supply or that price ceiling cross that demand curve. So if we go down, this is going to tell us our quantity demanded. You can read that. And this right here, this Q1 is going to tell us our quantity supplied. So we know that because we're going across from left to right, this price ceiling, where it hits the supply curve. We go down, that's our quantity supplied. Once again, when that price ceiling hits that demand curve, we're going to find our quantity demand from that. So as a result, this Q1 and this Q4 are going to be the two numbers that we're going to use to find the difference between them to calculate how much shortage, how many people are left without this good that want this good, right? All right, so if we go to the next slide, it's going to show us that, yeah, Q1, Q4. All right, let's clear all the drawings. All right, moving on. So this slide is a little tricky. This is kind of a trick question here. Click on the allocatively efficient point. So in this graph, we see that there must have been some kind of externality. Some kind of good is being taxed on the producer side. It's on that supply side. So when I say allocatively efficient point, any market without that tax, any market that is naturally occurring that isn't being distorted by this additional tax, that is going to be our allocatively efficient point. So we're going to find the point where supply and demand cross for that. And so this is our most efficient point, this Q4 P3, all right? Now we come in, we're throwing this tax in, and so our new equilibrium is going to be all the way now, instead of at Q4 P3, we are now at Q3 P4. So higher price, less quantity at that amount. Okay, so this is our allocatively efficient point, and after the tax, this is going to be that equilibrium. All right. So we can see once again, that's our allocatively efficient point. All right, moving on to a graph of externalities, it looks like. So we're looking at the marginal social cost, marginal social benefit, and then the marginal private cost, marginal private benefit, okay? So first they're gonna come in and say, click on the market equilibrium. So once again, this is a little bit of a trick question. We have two kind of crosses here. So in order to find that market equilibrium point, I know that in a market, an externality is considered an externality because these costs are not being considered in the market. In order to find that market equilibrium, we want to go off of that marginal private benefit and marginal private cost because we're not considering those third parties. So that market equilibrium is going to be right here at P2, Q1. Socially optimal, though, if we wanted to talk about the social optimum, we would want to be up here. So this looks like a positive externality because we see the private benefit is less than the social benefit. So at every point, at every quantity point, originally we were pricing at P1. So if we want to look at quantity 2, we're going to price at P1. But because of this additional benefit being given off by this externality, at quantity 2, if we really wanted to account for the positive externality, we would be charging P3. All right. But because that's our big issue with externalities, the private cost versus that social cost and that private benefit versus that social benefit, because this is a market equilibrium point, like I said, we're going to be down here. Even though socially optimal point is up here, we could be selling more for a higher price, but we're going to stay down here because, like I said, it's the market equilibrium. These third-party costs or third-party benefits are not being considered. All right, moving on. All right, so we talked about that socially optimal point where originally we had that point down here. This is our market. This is our market equilibrium. But where that social curve, those social curves cross is going to be that social optimum. So say I want to now find the dead weight loss here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my private market equilibrium and I'm going to go up from this point, from where that equilibrium is. I'm going to go up to my social benefit curve. So this is all the social benefit I am losing by only producing at this equilibrium, right? So all the way up, this is all that benefit I am losing. And then we can see our triangle right here. All right, so this externality must be a positive externality and we want more of it. So instead of saying this is an externality and we need to minimize it, we're saying this is an externality. People are benefiting from whatever this is. So let's produce more. We want to produce more, okay? All right, so in the case of a negative externality, the social marginal cost. So we just looked at this graph where we had a positive externality. When we have that negative externality, what we're going to see is this. So we have our okay. So now in this case, graph, I'm showing some curves. I'm showing that social marginal cost curve and that private marginal cost curve. I'm also showing the private marginal benefit curve and that social marginal benefit curve. So, because this is negative externality, that social marginal cost is going to be higher. So actually, we're not going to see PMC equal SMC. What we're going to see, so this is our private marginal cost. What we're going to see is that social marginal cost is because it's a negative externality, we need to account for this burden of a cost, this negative cost. So at every point, our costs are higher. So that's why we are shifting leftward, right? We're shifting this way. We're shifting in. this is a negative shift. So that social marginal cost, like I said, is going to be higher than that private marginal cost. So we're in that private market equilibrium. We're not taking that social marginal cost curve we're not taking it into account. We are looking at the private marginal cost and private marginal benefit. So to go back to this question, in the case of a negative externality, we now know that at every point that social marginal cost is going to be greater than that private marginal cost. So at this quantity, if we were to go down and say, okay, whatever quantity this is right here, we're going to charge this price for the private. And if we're just talking about private market, and this is what, excuse me, this would be the price that we would charge if we wanted to consider those social costs that come with this externality. So the price is higher. So, excuse me. So our final answer is going to be that A, exceed private marginal cost. Okay. And if you don't understand that, please send me an email. We'll talk about that more in depth, one-on-one. But like I said, at every point, that social marginal cost is higher than that private marginal cost. All right. So externalities can happen during the production process or during the consumption process. All right. So this is showing a positive externality during consumption. So this could be something like, all right, I've got one. A positive externality when I drink coffee. When I drink coffee, I drink it for me. I'm not thinking about all the other cost and factors that go into it. So when I drink coffee in the morning, I'm definitely a much happier person afterwards, not just because I had that coffee, but having that coffee in the morning makes me a much happier person. So let's say that's a positive externality. So the benefit of me getting a coffee is higher than the private benefit. It's not just benefit to me, it's a benefit to everyone else around me. So that marginal benefit is going to be greater than that private benefit. So like I said, if I worked in an office every day and walked in and some days didn't have my coffee, sure, I'll be cranky. That's a negative cost to all my coworkers. But when I have a coffee, this extra benefit from my coffee of me being nicer, being a much happier person, that is why that social benefit is going to be shifted to the right. It's greater than that private benefit. So first, this graph wants us to label the social optimal point. So we said the social optimum is different than that market optimum, that market equilibrium. So in order to find the social optimal, we want to go to our social marginal benefit curve. We want to go here, see where it crosses that private marginal cost curve. And here is our equilibrium right here. So we would be at whatever quantity this may be and whatever price this may be, if we wanted to account for the social externality, this positive externality. All right. So now show where that free market equilibrium would be. So we're kind of doing this backwards this time around, but that's all right. That free market equilibrium is only taking private costs, private benefits. So we go to where that private cost curve and that private benefit curve cross. So now, instead of being over here and up here with price and quantity, we are now lesser quantity and a lesser price. So I think the next question is going to ask us to show the deadweight loss, and I was correct. So before I got ahead of myself, let's go ahead and show how to calculate that deadweight loss now. So like I said, we're losing some kind of gains from trade. Socially, we want more of this good. It's creating this positive externality. So the social optimum is always going to be greater than that private optimum. So what we're going to do is go from that private market optimum all the way up to that social marginal benefit curve, because that's what we're losing. We're losing the rest of this trade right here. We're losing this part of the market when we say, hey, we're only producing to this quantity, we're charging this price. Okay. They could charge a higher price. They could produce a higher quantity. everybody would be better off. And so this is why dead weight loss is such a frustrating thing, because once again, everybody would be better off at this point, but because we're of a free market and we're trading at the private cost and private benefit, we're not thinking about everyone else. We're not accounting for these externalities. Everybody is going to lose some kind of gains that we could have had otherwise from this trade. All right, I hope that makes sense for everyone. Clear some things up. So here we saw a positive externality during consumption. So where the marginal benefit curve was increasing. Here, if we want to see a positive externality during production, what we're going to see is that marginal cost curve actually come down when it is a production side thing, when it's a supply side thing. So when we see that externality in production, we know it's going to be a supply curve kind of thing. So at every given point, because of this positive externality, at every given point, that private cost is higher than what that social optimal would be actually. So because this is a positive externality, socially, we want more produced of whatever good this may be. But because we're trading at that private cost, once again, we're going to be up here rather than on this social marginal cost curve. So if we want to see the dead weight loss associated with this positive externality during the production process, like I said, optimally, everybody would be so much happier and better off at this social marginal cost and social marginal benefit cross right here. But because we're a free market and we're looking at where private parties can trade and create these transactions, we're going to be up here. So what we're going to do is go from this point where our equilibrium is, that market equilibrium, we're going to go down to that social marginal cost curve and find our triangle right here. So this is that dead weight loss associated with this positive externality because we're not producing more. We should be producing more. All right. All right. All right, so we already talked about that. And finally, which of the following incentivizes someone to reduce a negative externality? Each of the following provides incentive to reduce a negative externality except for. So going through a merger with affected firms, a merger could help cut costs. It could help cut whatever this next negative externality is. So I don't think it's going to be A. Subsidizing consumption of a good being produced. So this sounds like something that wouldn't incentivize a negative externality. If we're subsidizing, what a subsidy is going to be a remedy for a positive externality. We want more of something, so we're going to subsidize for the production of this. So in this case, this is a little fishy. B is a little fishy. We'll come back to it. C, bargaining among firms. That definitely will provide incentive to reduce negative externality on both parts and both parties as well. Taxation of externality, yes, amazing. This is exactly what we would do to deal with a negative externality. Taxation of a negative externality would be the remedy to kind of incentivize away from this behavior. When we subsidize, we're kind of encouraging more production, more purchasing, more consuming of this good. So my answer is going to be B for this. All right, let's check it out and look at it. Look at that. It is B. All right. So I hope this cleared things up. If you have any questions, bring them to the review session tomorrow or shoot me an email before Friday in the exam. All right. Thank you for watching.